Welcome to this Wise Owl Excel VBA tutorial. In this part of the series, we're going to look at how to print in Google Chrome using Selenium. So we'll start with a simple option of sending a keyboard shortcut to Chrome and how to print in kiosk mode so that you don't have to confirm your printing, Chrome will just print using your default settings. Then we'll look at what you need to do if you want to change your print settings by referencing the print settings page, and how to change various settings by doing things like selecting from drop-down lists and entering values into inputs. Finally, we'll show you how to click the print button to print what you've requested using the settings you've applied. So let's get started. To get started, I've created a new Excel workbook, and in the Visual Basic editor, I've already written some fairly standard basic code to open a new instance of Chrome and then navigate to Wikipedia's main page. This is dependent, of course, on having set a reference to the Selenium type library. If I head to the Tools menu and choose References, you can see that I've already done that part here. That's dependent, of course, on having installed Selenium in the first place, which I'll assume you've already done if you're following along with this video, but just in case you haven't, there's a quick video that explains how to get set up and running with Selenium Basic. Having done all that already, let's give our code a quick test run to make sure we can open up our new instance of Chrome, which we do, and we navigate to Wikipedia's main page. And the next thing I'd like to do is programmatically send the keyboard shortcut Ctrl and P to that web page. So if I press Ctrl and P while Chrome is displayed on screen, you'll probably know that it fires up the print dialog box. So we'd like to do that programmatically. So I've closed down that instance of Chrome. To add that line to my subroutine, let's give myself a blank line to give myself a bit of space. One thing that's quite important here is that we don't use the SendKeys method of the Chrome driver. You may have seen in previous videos me using the SendKeys method by saying cd.sendkeys. For this example, I want to make sure we're using the VBA SendKeys method. So don't precede this with a reference to the Chrome driver. Simply say SendKeys followed by a space, and then in some double quotes, the code required to send a Control key and the P key at the same time. The caret is the symbol that simulates the Control key, followed by the letter P, close the double quotes, and then if we run the subroutine again, we'll see we open up Chrome, navigate to Wikipedia, and then it fires up the print dialog box automatically. Let's just close that down and then move on to the next bit. Just a quick note on why I didn't use the SendKeys method of the Chrome driver object. The fairly simple reason is that it doesn't appear to work, or at least I couldn't get it to work. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to declare a variable that holds a reference to a new instance of a Selenium keys class. So I'm going to say dimks as new selenium.keys. And then I'm just going to comment out the SendKeys method I've written for VBA, and I'm going to say cd.sendkeys. The modifier key that I'm going to use is going to be ks.control, followed by a comma, and then the key I'll press in combination with the control key is the letter P. Now in principle that should work, but it seems to have absolutely no effect whatsoever when we run the subroutine. So the keyboard shortcut has been sent, it's just not influenced the Chrome driver. I'm not entirely sure why, but I just know that that doesn't work, whereas the VBA SendKeys method does. So I'm going to get rid of the cd.sendkeys line and bring back the VBA version. I'm going to keep my variable for the Selenium keys class though. We will use that a little later on in the video when things get a bit more complicated. So let's keep that in there for now and then move on and look at how to actually get that page to be printed. By far the easiest way to get this page printed is just to assume that we want to use all the default settings which appear in the print dialog box, and when we press Ctrl and P to have the page printed immediately. Now the default settings you'll see in the dialog box will depend on which profile you're using for the instance of Chrome you've opened up. At the moment we're not specifying a profile, so we're using Chrome anonymously. If you did want to use a specific profile to get access to your saved print settings, then we do have a quick video which explains how to open Chrome using a specific user profile. But for this one we're going to continue with the anonymous profile. So to do this, we need to set an argument of the Chrome driver before we start it. So let's add a couple of blank lines and say cd.addArgument. And then in some double quotes, I'm going to type in double hyphen and then kiosk-printing. So that will basically prevent Chrome from waiting for us to confirm that we want to print something, if I just run the subroutine now, we will see the print dialog box open briefly, but then it immediately sends that to the printer, and of course it tells me that my printer's offline because I'm not currently connected to it, so my printer called Tinkerbell is not available at the moment. But if I just double click on the printer icon in the system tray, you can see that I've sent the Wikipedia main page to the printer. Let's just right click and cancel that document now, because I don't want to have that printed out when I do finally reconnect to that printer. So that's the easy way to do it, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just leave it at that? But of course there are going to be times where you'll want to change some of those default print options, and this is where things get a bit tricky. Just to show you the first thing we'll need to do, this is actually one of the easier things. If I head over to an open version of the Wikipedia main page and press Ctrl and P, you can hopefully see that the print dialog box opens in a separate window altogether. So the first thing we need to do is switch to that window. I'll just cancel out of that and show you that we do have a video which explains this in a bit more detail as part of our Getting Data from Websites playlist, working with multiple tabs in Selenium. This one's fairly straightforward though. If I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, first of all I'm going to comment out the kiosk printing argument, and then after sending keys we're going to say simply cd.switch to next window. That means that when we start searching for elements in a moment, we'll be searching for elements in the print dialog box, not the Wikipedia main page. So now we can start searching for elements which represent the various print options, and this is where things get tricky. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to switch back to the Wikipedia main page in an open instance of Chrome, and if I press Ctrl and P to launch the print dialog box, let's start by trying to just change the layout of the page from portrait to landscape. If I right click on that drop down list element and choose to inspect it, we'll see that it's simply a reference to a select element. Now we've created a video fairly recently which explains how to work with select drop down lists in Selenium. So the drop down list itself is pretty straightforward. What is a bit tricky however is how that layout drop down list element is nested within all of the other elements. So you can see that it's nested inside a print preview settings element, which itself is nested inside a print preview layout settings element, which has a shadow root. Now again, in a previous video you may remember how awkward it is to get references to elements in the shadow document object model. So what makes this even trickier is how many different levels of shadow roots there are. So print preview layout settings is held inside the print preview sidebar with its shadow root, which itself is held inside the print preview app with a shadow root. So we've got quite a lot of levels to walk through to get to that drop-down list. The sidebar is quite an important one for us. Most of the other elements we're going to access are held within this one. So to begin with, let's try to get a reference to the sidebar element and store that in a variable. So let's switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and look at how we can do that. We'll start by declaring a variable to hold a reference to the sidebar element. So let's say dim, and I'm going to call mine something like PRV, short for preview or print preview, sidebar as a selenium.web element. Then after we've switched to the next window, we can say set PRV sidebar equals cd.execute script. So we're going to use a bit of JavaScript to get access to the shadow root of the particular element we're interested in. So in some open round brackets, I'm going to type in a space underscore so I can write this across multiple lines. I'll say script : equals, and then the basic JavaScript we need is say return arguments square brackets 0 dot shadow root. And it's quite important that we use the correct case there. JavaScript's case sensitive. So I'll close the double quotes for the script, follow that with a comma, and then a space underscore, and then the arguments parameter, we're going to provide a reference to the element containing the shadow root that we want to return. So we're going to begin by getting a reference to the print preview app shadow root. So I'm just going to copy that name to the clipboard from the DevTools window, head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we're going to use one of the standard find element methods to find that specific element. So let's say cd.findElement by, go with your favorite one. I tend to use CSS because it's a bit more flexible than the other dedicated techniques. And then in some double quotes, I can simply paste in the tag name that I've copied. I can then close the double quotes and close two sets of round brackets to get a reference to the shadow root of that print preview app. Now, of course, what I really want to do with this preview sidebar variable is get a reference to the shadow root of the sidebar element. So the next step is to use the shadow root we've just captured a reference to go down another level into the print preview sidebar. It's got virtually the same name as the previous one, print preview app, print preview sidebar. So a bit of copy and pasting here. We're going to reset the value or the reference in the PRV sidebar variable to be equal to the same basic script. We're still trying to return a shadow root, but this time the element we're starting our search from is the preview sidebar, so that what we've currently got stored in this variable. So let's change the CD reference to PRV sidebar, and then we can change the print preview app to search for print preview sidebar instead. Okay, let's just give our code a quick test at this point to make sure we haven't introduced any errors. If I hit the run button, we won't see anything printed, of course. We'll see the dialog box opens up. We won't have changed anything. But the important thing is if I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, we haven't received any runtime errors. Now we can get a reference to the next shadow root, which represents the print preview layout settings. So we've gotten down to this shadow root for the sidebar. Inside there is another shadow root attached to the print preview layout settings. So I want to capture this in a separate variable. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor and let's declare a new variable. I'll call it PRV layout settings, something like that, as selenium.webElement. Then something very similar to what we've just done already. In fact, let's copy and paste one more time the basic code for getting a reference to the shadow root. And then we'll say set PRV layout settings equals cd.execute script. The arguments this time, again, we're going to begin at the sidebar element and we're going to try to find an element by CSS, but we're going to look for print preview layout settings. So let's copy that to the clipboard and then just replace print preview sidebar in there. Finally, we can get a reference to the select drop-down list element. And again, if we just switch back to the dev tools page, we can find that that's the select element. It's got a specific class md-select, but as this is the only select element in that shadow root, the easiest thing to do is just get it using its tag name. So in the Visual Basic Editor, let's declare a new variable. I'm going to call this one PRV layout drop list or something along those lines. And then I'm going to make this a selenium.select element rather than a generic web element. This just gives us an advantage when we want to assign a value or select a value from this element. So much easier to get a reference to this one. We can simply say set PRV layout drop list equals, and then referring to the PRV layout settings shadow root, we can then find element by CSS once more, and then in some double quotes and round brackets, we can simply look for a select element. Now I want to make sure that we return the reference to this element as a select element. The find element by CSS method returns a reference as a generic web element. So at the end of this line, we'll say as select. Okay, so now that we've got references to all the things we need, let's have a quick check if we run the subroutine that we don't introduce any new errors. So we get everything loaded up. Nothing again has changed yet. We're not quite at that stage, but we haven't introduced any errors into our code. Okay, so now for the easy bit, selecting an element from that drop-down list. If we just head back to the dev tools page that we have open, if we find that select element and then expand it, we'll see it has two options. They have value and text that match, so the value is portrait and the text is portrait, value landscape, text landscape. So to make use of those, we could head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we can simply say prv layout drop list dot select by either text or value. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go select by value, and then in some double quotes, let's go for landscape. Okay, so if we run our subroutine one more time, we will see that we load the page, load the print preview, and we see that portrait has changed to landscape. Now, of course, the other main thing we need to do when we're not printing in kiosk mode is to actually tell Chrome to print the page using the settings we've applied. And to do that, we can click on the print button. So to get access to that print button, if I switch back to the DevTools page I've already got open, if I scroll downwards in here, we can find that there's a print preview button strip element. And if I expand that, once again, there's a shadow root attached to that. If I expand that, there's a list of buttons in there somewhere. So there should be, in the controls section, an action button and a cancel button. So we want to get access to the button whose class is action button. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I think we should declare at least a couple of extra variables for this just to make it easier to write the code. Let's say something like dim prv button strip as selenium.webElement, and then dim prv print button. This one is probably a little unnecessary. The extra T there was definitely unnecessary, as a selenium.webElement. Okay, what we can do then, once more, is copy and paste something. I'm going to copy one of these bits of code that uses the sidebar as its starting point. So I'm going to copy and paste this set preview layout settings section. Paste that in down below, and then change what we're setting to be prv button strip. Then I'm going to start searching from the sidebar. That's the element that this button strip is nested inside. And then just going back briefly to DevTools, find print preview button strip and copy that tag name to the clipboard, and then paste it in over print preview layout settings. The next thing we can do is search for the action button, or the button with the action button class assigned to it. So let's say set prv print button equals, and then prv button strip dot find element by CSS, and then in some round brackets and double quotes. If I just switch back to DevTools again and find the class assigned to that button is action button. So let's copy that. Head back to the Visual Basic Editor. When we're searching for a class, we precede that with a full stop when we're using the by CSS method. And then, once we've captured a reference to that button, we can simply click on it. So we can say prv print button dot click, which I've failed to do. There we go. Try again. Dot click. All right. So at this point, if we run the subroutine one more time, I should be told that Tinkerbell is still offline. It certainly is, but it has sent that page now to the printer, even without using the kiosk mode. Let's cancel that document and then close down that instance of Chrome and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor to see what's next. To finish off the video, I'd like to look at changing one more print setting. This is a little more fiddly than the drop-down list we've just worked with. I'd like to look at how to change the number of copies. If I right-click on that element in my print preview page and choose to inspect it, we'll find that it's an input element, and that's nested inside quite a long chain of different shadow roots. So just scrolling slightly upwards, it's inside a shadow root attached to this CR input element, which is in a span in a div. So that's not actually inside the next shadow root. You can see there it's not inside print preview settings section, but it is inside the print preview number settings section shadow root, which itself is inside the print preview copies settings shadow root, and that one is nested inside the sidebar. So we've already referenced the sidebar shadow root, which is good news. let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor and start walking through this chain of shadow routes to get to that input element. So if I scroll up to the top of the subroutine first of all, I think this warrants a new variable. Let's call this something like PRV copies settings. And I'll just sort out that capitalization in a moment, as a selenium.web element. Okay, so let's just get rid of that capital O there and make it a lowercase o. Alright, the next thing I'd like to do, it doesn't matter too much where we do this as long as we change the setting before we attempt to print something. So maybe we should insert this before we get a reference to the print preview button strip. Let's give ourselves a few blank lines there to give ourselves some space. So I want to search first of all for this element inside the sidebar. So let's copy and paste a section that gets the shadow root of the preview layout settings. And then it's fairly easy to change this. We've got a new variable called copies settings. And the name of the tag is also copies settings, print preview copy settings. Next, let's have a look back at the dev tools. So we've got the print preview copy settings shadow root. The next one down was a slightly longer one, print preview number settings section. So I'm definitely not going to write that out myself. I'm going to copy and paste it. So let's take that across to the Visual Basic Editor. I'll paste it in as a comment temporarily. And then we can copy the 3 lines we've just pasted and adapted. And then we're going to reset the PRV copies settings variable by searching from that element. So let's update the arguments there to begin searching from PRV copies settings. And then print preview number settings section is the name of the tag we're looking for. Okay, so one more of those to do. We've got to find one more shadow root. So scrolling downwards, remember it's not nested inside the shadow root of print preview settings section. It's nested inside the shadow root of the element whose tag is cr-input. Now this one's got a unique ID called user value. So I'm going to use a user value for my next element. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And I'm going to just copy and paste the previous 3 lines, in fact. That's the easiest thing to do. And then we can replace this print preview number settings section tag name with a reference to an ID. Now when we're using a CSS selector, IDs begin with a hash symbol, and I believe it was called user value. Let me just quickly check that that's the case. Yeah, user value there. Perfect. Alright, so now we've done all that, there is just one last element we need to get a reference to, and that's the input element itself. Again, that's got its own unique ID called input. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. I think it's worthwhile declaring a new variable for this one, just like we did for our drop-down list earlier on. So let's call this something like dim PRV copies as selenium.web element, just a generic web element. And then scrolling back down to where we've just captured the reference to wherever it was. It's in here somewhere, user value, there it goes. So many lines that look the same. We can say set PRV copies equals PRV copies settings dot find element by CSS, and then in some double quotes and round brackets, hash input. Close the double quotes, close the round brackets, and that should give us access to that input element. Let's just give the code a quick test run at this point. In fact, I'm just going to make sure we don't click the print button by commenting out that line. But just to make sure we haven't introduced any new errors, let's run the subroutine, make sure it reaches the end, and then switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and make sure we don't have any errors lingering around. So finally, we can change the value of that input element by using the SendKeys method of the element itself. So let's say PRV copies dot SendKeys, and let's say we wanted to print 3 copies. Now there's going to be a small problem with this, as you'll see in just a moment. So having sent the keys 3, if we run the subroutine, we'll find the print preview loads, and it has indeed typed in the number 3 into that copies input. But annoyingly, it hasn't replaced the existing text, the number 1, in there. So what we really want to do is make sure that we overwrite rather than just append to that box. And the easiest way to do that is to select all the text in that element before you type in the next value. And this is why we saved our keys class variable from earlier on. So remember dim ks as new selenium.keys. If we head back down here, and before we send the keys 3, we say prvcopies.sendkeys, and then we're going to use the control key modifier, ks.control, followed by a comma, and then the letter A to select all. So if we run the subroutine again, we'll see that this time it replaces the number of copies rather than appends the number 3 to the end. And having done all of that, if we now finally uncomment the click of our print button, we'll see there are no current documents waiting for Tinkerbell. Let's run the subroutine one final time, and all of those pages and copies will be sent to Tinkerbell, who is indeed still offline, but now has this new entry in the print list. So there you go, that's how you can write VBA using Selenium to print web pages from Google Chrome. Hopefully you'll never need to change your print settings and you can just happily accept all the default settings and just use kiosk printing for the simplest solution. But at least now you know how you can change those print settings if you need to. So hopefully you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.